All right, I'm just going to start. This is for third-party risk management, so if this is not the talk that you want to be at, you might want to go down to the lounge. So today I will be covering third-party risk management. I picked this topic because I always feel like third-party risk management is lacking when I go to conferences, so I thought this would be a really great topic that people could relate to and possibly take back information to their organization. A little about me. My name is Rose. I was in the Navy for about 8 years. I got out of the Navy and I went to the civilian sector, and I've worked in healthcare, retail, the DoD environment, and now I'm a GRC consultant at CISO. I will also be doing this talk at BSides Pittsburgh next week, so if you think of any questions and you happen to go to that conference, you can just always hit me up. So first I'm going to just start with a little intro here. Third parties, they're everywhere. Every business is going to be utilizing them for whatever services they may need. Business wants to move lightning quick, and unfortunately, we have to try to keep up with them, and it's very, very hard to do. The business wants to just bring these vendors in, these third parties, without assessing them before we do anything. Yeah, we all know. And so I call this presentation the overlooked security risk. We all know it's a risk. When I mean overlooked, I mean the business overlooks the security risk. They think it's very easy to just bring these vendors on, and it's not an issue. But it is an issue because they're introducing a lot of risks to our environment that we need to make sure the business is aware of. So by the end of this presentation, I'm going to tell you guys what your third-party management program should look like, give you an idea of like the process flow, but I'm also going to show you guys how to incorporate automation with tools that you may have readily available. I want to be very mindful that not everybody has the budget or the resources to implement a SaaS solution, so we have to be really creative with the tools that we do have access to. What exactly is third-party risk management? Third-party risk management is a due diligence process that we utilize to look at security controls for third parties. We want to validate their confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the security controls that they have in place. But more importantly, we want to enable the business to make risk-aware decisions. It's not our responsibility in security to accept the risks that these third parties are posing onto our organization. It's the business responsibility to accept these risks. So we are going to enable them to make risk-aware decisions by conducting these risk assessments. So what is the life cycle of a vendor at your organization? Well, this is a very high-level vendor life cycle. There's a governance. We need to establish what is the criteria in which we're conducting these assessments. What controls are we enforcing on our organization? There's planning. What type of RFP process is occurring? Is procurement involved? The due diligence process, which we're going to get more into in a second, is our portion in security, how we're assessing these vendors. Contract negotiation. This is when legal's being involved in looking at these contracts and making sure that the business is being protected. Ongoing monitoring. The contract is in place. We've done the risk assessments. Okay, well, now we need to monitor that vendor on a regular basis, especially if they're a PCI vendor. And then termination. Whenever the contract ends, we just stop doing business with this vendor. We need to make sure that it's terminated correctly. More importantly, we need to make sure our data is destroyed and we get certificate of destruction or verification of that. We don't want to leave any of our data with the vendor. And so that termination portion is also very important. Now we're going to jump into the due diligence process. This is where we will primarily live. It's most important to us. So this due diligence process is when we're assessing the vendor, we're looking at all the findings, we're communicating these findings, and we're giving the business a scorecard so they can make a good decision. The first step in this process is the scoping. We need to understand what type of services this vendor is going to be providing to our organization. If we don't understand the scope of services, it's going to be very, very hard to accurately assess them. So a couple things that you could inquire about what is the data classification for this vendor. If your organization has data classification in place, you want to ask this because you want to understand what type of data the vendor will be getting. Are they going to store, transmit, or process data on behalf of your organization? If any of the data is leaving your environment, you absolutely need to know how the vendor will be protecting it for you. You want to know if they need remote access into your environment. And you also want to know if they're providing software as a service because you want to ask questions around how that platform is built and how people will be authenticating to it and just get more clarity around that service. The next portion is the actual risk assessment. For this, you're using the risk assessment to evaluate their overall security posture. You're going to use standardized questionnaires that you built, and you're going to validate those responses using independent certifications or reports. So you can use a SOC 2, Type 2, AOC. You can also use their ISO certification. And this is used in conjunction with the risk assessment just to validate those responses. If your organization is working with a vendor that may not be to that level where they have those certifications, you could possibly do artifact reviews or on-site audits. It just depends on how far the vendor is willing to go for your organization's business, to be honest. And you also want to make sure you're doing consistent analysis by incorporating risk scoring. Whenever you build your first risk assessment, it's really important that you grade those questions on the importance to your organization. Some questions will be really important to your organization, while other questions may be more important to other organizations. So it's important that you risk score based on your organization. Right now, I'm going to jump a little bit into the risk assessment. Previously, when I did this presentation, I would give a little sample of it, but I decided today that I would incorporate that into the demo. If you guys have any questions about building risk assessments, please contact me after this. I have found that the easiest way to build a risk assessment, if you are not familiar with it, is using the Nist Cybersecurity framework. It lays out all the controls that would be very important for you to understand for another organization. It makes it very easy to just go line by line and say yes or no, you want to ask that sort of question and reword it to your environment. If you're a little more educated on asking risk assessments or building them, you can always just make sure you're hitting these functional areas. I like to build my risk assessments around these functional areas because it's going to give you insight into their overall security posture, which is really important. So once you ask the risk assessment, the vendor's going to send you back the questionnaire, and more than likely there's going to be findings. There's always findings. It's our responsibility and security to make sure that we're effectively communicating these findings to the business. And then we need to make sure that we're telling them why this is a risk, why they need to be concerned about it, and we need to give them possible options for remediation. So, remediation. Remediation is occurring with the vendor if you could get them to make the changes that they need. This is really, you can incorporate this with the contract as well. So, if the vendor is not willing to remediate or you're having issues with it, you could write it into the contract, say that this is absolutely a must, you must have this in place. And if they're really willing for your business, then more than likely they'll fix it. Now, if it's something that will require a very large budget, you may get some pushback on it. But if it's something like, okay, we need to write an information security policy, okay, we can do that. So it just depends on the circumstance of the issue that was found. Risk acceptance. I don't know if any of you guys heard me earlier. I was speaking to my friend here in the crowd. Anytime there's a risk that comes up from this assessment, it is the business's responsibility to accept that risk. Security should not be accepting this risk, and this is where it's really important that we are communicating effectively to the business to make sure they truly understand what this vendor is posing to the organization. So these findings need to be documented, and they need to be in a consistent format. This is going to make your life easier, and it's going to make the workforce easier and more accepting to this new process that you're trying to put in place. If it's always uniform, they're going to understand it better and they're going to be more willing to do it. It should include the risk, the score, the reason for acceptance. Reason for acceptance cannot be they just don't want to look for another vendor. It needs to be something legitimate. You've seen that before probably, yes. Some vendors offer certain solutions that they're the only ones. And so that's a case where, yeah, you have to accept that risk. Or maybe they've already done X amount of work with them, and so they're accepting that risk for that reason. Any risk found should ultimately roll up to enterprise risk management, and you should be collecting metrics on this. And finally, you need a scorecard. You need an output of these risks. It needs to be a constant report deliverable, something that will always look the same, again, keeping it uniformed. You need to communicate the key points of the risk assessment. What were the main issues found? You need to indicate the overall risk score and any risk acceptance. This scorecard is typically what's going to be used to go up to the executives. It's going to be disseminated through whoever's involved with this vendor. So it's really important that we keep it to one page, make it pretty, because we all know that executives like pretty pictures, and just make it very easy and consumable. Okay, what now? How do I make this easier for myself? I wanted to use this picture desperately. And I went to my husband and I'm like, do you know what picture this is? It's just a little girl with her hands up in the air with pigtails. I don't know where to find this picture. He found it for me. And I thought it was just so funny. How do I make this easier for myself? Risk assessments, this whole process, there's tons of steps. It's so miserable. You have to do this and this and this and this and this and go down the line. You have to talk to people. And it just gets really tedious. So how do I make this easier for myself? Well, you make it easier for yourself with automation. Now, not everybody's going to have a budget to get a software. They don't have the budget for resources. Maybe it's one person doing the job that 3 people should be doing and assessing these vendors. Your organization maybe doesn't make a lot of money and you can't afford a SaaS solution. So you have to be very creative in making automation work for you. So we are going to skip talking about SaaS because I only incorporated automation using tools that were available to me. So some of these tools, you could use Excel, PowerShell if you're comfortable with it, Word, Outlook, SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, whatever you want. You absolutely just have to be creative with it. So it all starts with an idea. When I was trying to think of how I would present this to you guys today, I went to the best place for doing this, the whiteboard. How was I going to show to you guys the best way to automate? So I thought, what do I want to see? Well, I need to know scoping. I need to know what the business is going to do with this vendor. I know I'm going to have to send an email out, and I need to receive an email. I need to be able to grade, and I need to be able to have that scorecard at the end. There's a couple steps that I quite wasn't able to incorporate, but I just want to show you guys that automation is absolutely possible, or making your lives easier with tools that you already have is very much possible. So with that, we're just going to go to the demo. And hopefully it works. Alright. So, this is Microsoft Teams. Has anybody in here used Teams yet? I know it's fairly recent. Okay, a few people. I really enjoy Teams. You can make different channels. You control the access. You control the content. You can do whatever you want on it. You could post messages. You can make forms. You can do whatever. But not everybody has Teams yet. Most people still have SharePoint. Anybody in here still utilizing SharePoint at all? Yeah, a couple. So with SharePoint, you can still make forms, and you can still have your users go to that. But for the purpose of this demo, I use Teams just because it's my personal preference. So what I did was I mentioned scoping. We need to know what the business is doing. So I built a form in here. The form asks a couple basic questions. Who's responsible? What's the business organization? I put Dunder Mifflin because I love The Office. I put my own email. And what kind of data will be transferred? I just put stuff. Are they going to store, transmit, process? And I'm going through this really quick. I am so sorry. I should have slowed it down for you guys. What's the type of classification? How data is going to be transferred? And will they have remote access, or will they be software as a service? And what I'd also like to point out, you see the asterisks? I made those required questions. So the business has to answer that before they can submit their questionnaire. And I also learned with forms you could do conditional questions. So I didn't get too much into that, but it's definitely something you can pursue. So now I received this form to my Outlook. And it can do this whenever you have a new form, so you don't have to be constantly checking Teams to see if you have new data. And it shows you all the responses. Okay, good. But there's nothing I can do with this data. I need it in Excel. So I'm going to export this to Excel. And it's going to open up. And what I'm going to also show you at the same time is this master risk assessment sheet that I made. So this is the output. This is the master sheet. This is where I'm going to keep all information about this vendor, so that way I have one single point of reference all the time. So you'll see there was a scoping sheet. This is the risk assessment. It has all the information I need. It has the questions. It says what type of risk it is. It also will have a column for responses, which you'll see later. It has the risk levels, the risk score, and right now it says 61 because it's tallying up all those, but once we actually put the responses in, it'll change. So now what I'm going to do is use macros to export this data and put it into another Excel spreadsheet. It's going to put it into that master data sheet. So now I have all that information in one place, and it's going to pull all the data from the other sheet into here. And now the information's in a nice format that I could easily print off whenever I need to. And I have the email for the vendor. I'm now going to email the vendor, which is just myself. And I'm going to do this using a macro in Outlook, which I didn't realize was a possibility until I started going through this. I put the vendor's email in there, and it's already CC'd to go to myself. It has the subject, it has the risk assessment, and it has the text that I want the vendor to get. So if you're doing these all the time, you're going to make your life so much easier with the click of a button. And to take it even further, you can also make a macro to pull email addresses from an Excel spreadsheet. So I should get the email now. And so this is me filling it out as the vendor. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger because it showed up super teeny tiny and no one can read that. And I'm going to save it to my desktop just like a vendor would, because the vendor is going to open it up, just save it wherever, and then just answer it. Okay. So, for this questionnaire, I didn't want the vendor to receive the same view that I saw in the master spreadsheet, because I don't want them to know what I consider risky questions or not. Because if they see that risk score, they may change their answers knowing that a certain question is a higher risk. And I don't want them to lie. So, hopefully this mitigates that. So, they get their question. They get additional information, because it's not always going to be a security person filling out these questionnaires. It may just be, some IT person that kind of has to do it. So I give them additional information that hopefully helps them better understand what the intention of the question is. I just put in a few responses in here. The hope is that if they mark no, that they actually explain why. I've been doing vendor risk assessments for a very long time, and they don't always put an explanation. You would hope they would, because then it would cut down on the back and forth, but that's not always the case. So for this, I just put in explanations to show you that you can do that in here. And the questions that they mark no to, just in case you can't see it, is do they maintain a flow diagram? Do they have an information security policy? And do they know their critical business functions? So they mark no to the bottom 3 questions. And by they, I mean me. I marked them no. So we're going to save this now and email it back to myself. And now in this next part, it was a little tricky to learn it, but I thought it was really useful. If you are assessing a lot of vendors and receiving a lot of questionnaires at once, you're going to have to download these questionnaires somewhere. You got to put them in a folder. Well, with Outlook, you can create a macro that will pull that information for you. So you can select multiple emails at once and pull all the attachments and put them into a designated folder. So here you're going to see me do that. I'm going to show you that you can still click on it, and you can do the drop down and save it wherever you want. But like I said, if you're receiving a lot of emails, that's not always the easiest solution for you. So I created a macro called Save Attachment. And with the click of a button, it saves the attachment, and it's going to open it up for me. And it's in its designated spot. I didn't have to do anything else. Now I need these responses to go over into the master spreadsheet. I want them to go into this response column because I want it to generate the scores for me. So we're going to go back to this other sheet. And I created a macro for this, but I probably didn't really need to, but I was going kind of crazy with it. So you're just copying all that data over there. Again, just showing you that you can do pretty much anything that you want in here. Now that the responses have been put in, you'll see that the score changed. And the score went down to 11 based on their responses, and they're now a medium. Now, what's really important, I'm using this spreadsheet as a scorecard. What I did was just import a formula that calculates what risks were actually identified, and I'm going to save it. And now what I'm going to do is click this button a bunch of times because I didn't remember what button was for my macro. Once I stopped clicking on it and I realized I need to go to the other thing. Right now, it's going to generate a PDF for me. And this is what you can send to the business. You can make it however you want. You can make it, have more information, explain other stuff. And it's going to save that PDF to my desktop for me. So I'm going to close out this PDF just so you guys can see that it is in fact the same PDF. And it's going to have the risk, it's going to have the score, it's going to have, the owner and the organization and who the vendor is. Now, I use this demo, like I said, as a way to show you how to use these tools that you have available to use automation for your benefit. Obviously, it's not going to be as awesome as having a SaaS solution that's going to be able to do automated scoring for you and all these cool little tricks. But when you're on a budget and it's just you can absolutely make it work for you and just make it as easy as possible and take a little bit of stress off your shoulders. And I'd like to say I also did this this past week as I had time. I did it in the afternoons whenever I had a spare moment. So it's not something that you need to dedicate weeks and weeks and weeks of your time to. Just a little time here and there, and you can absolutely achieve it. If you could be creative with it, you can absolutely do it. Okay, so originally I was supposed to speak for an hour. That didn't happen. I think it's maybe 4 o'clock now. But if you guys have any questions, you can get a hold of me at any of these contacts. I just recently created a Twitter, so I'm still learning it. Don't judge me. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah? Go ahead. Yeah. I think you will always have challenges getting the questionnaires back from the vendors, and honestly, it's just the nature of the beast. I think it's really important that you are communicating with whoever's bringing that vendor on from the very first point that you know about this vendor, that they're communicating with the vendor and saying, this is critical, the contract cannot be signed, or whatever can't happen. There have been times that I have gone on the phone with the vendors and worked them through the questionnaires. I don't like doing that because it puts too much responsibility on me, and I worry that I'm guiding them to the answer that I want them to give me versus them answering truthfully about what they're doing. Does that make sense? So one suggestion you could do to kind of get more responsiveness is at the very beginning of your process, whatever team's bringing this vendor on, start communicating what this process should look like and what their responsibilities are. So ask them to communicate with the vendor sooner and make the vendor understand that this could hold up the contract process, that you have to do this and they need to be responsive. And that's pretty much my best advice I could give you on that. You're not the only one, though. Go ahead. Offshore vendors? You know what? I haven't quite run into that too much. What kind of offshore vendors do you have that you work with? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so when you're trying to get them to answer the risk assessments, they're just not responsive? Yeah, they are a higher risk. Like I said, I don't have any experience with it, but if I'm just thinking off the cuff about it, I would probably just put them segregated in their own filing structures where I can easily manage them and keep track of what the risk is to our organization with those high-risk vendors, and probably roll it up to my risk management committee if you have that in place, so you're always discussing those high-risk vendors and the data that's being transferred with them. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Go ahead. Yeah, it's so hard to get people to care. You're like, can you please care about this data as much as I care about the data? So you say you work with HIPAA, so PHI? Okay, so if you're working with clients that work with PHI and they're just sending that data out of the door, they need to be very aware that they're violating security rule policies from HIPAA, and that they should absolutely be concerned about that because it could lead to a breach and it could lead to reputation damage and financial damage. So I think my biggest piece of advice is to put it into a dollar amount that they can understand. There you go. So if patient files are compromised and patient files are $150 for one record, okay, so 500 of them are compromised, that's X amount of dollars to them that they're going to lose. And then on top of that, reputational damage. All right. Awesome. Yes.
And they have major role in our application. There are few vendors who are just contract. There are few vendors who have just base of food providers. So there is type of vendors.
Yeah.
So any type of question or set of questions that we suggest, we allocate questions to all of them.
Yeah. Do you use a software, a SaaS, to manage your vendors? So it sounds like you need to make your life a lot easier managing with a SaaS solution. So the easiest way to probably manage your vendors with that would be during the intake process. You remember how I showed the form at the very beginning? So the business is probably going to be the most aware of what type of vendor it is. You could possibly ask them at the beginning in the scoping question to categorize the type of vendor. So if it's a consultant, if it's an application developer, whatever it may be. And so when you export those results, you'll have that historic reference for you, and you can start putting metrics against that and be able to gauge how many of those vendors you have in your environment. And I know you already asked about the high-risk vendors. You can also probably put, so let's say consultants are medium risk to your organization because they just won't have a lot of, proprietary information or whatever it may be. But the offshore engineers are going to be very high risk because the data is leaving the country and they're going to have, super confidential information. And that may be one way you can manage it outside of a SaaS solution. But if you do have a SaaS, I feel like your life would be a lot easier with that because it does sound like you kind of have more complexity with your vendors than normal. Does that help at all? Yeah, a little bit. Sorry. Any other questions? Yeah.
Regarding scoring, it seems like a lot of the questions are subjective and maybe like yes or no binary scoring.
Yeah.
Are there questions like that for data, like maybe how many critical high vulnerabilities they have for environment or something like that? Has like a quantitative data.
So, one, for the qualitative analysis, when you're picking those scores, I would highly recommend getting a team of people together to agree on the scores. So that way it's less subjective because to me, I may think, okay, you don't have vulnerability management in place. That's a very high risk. But another person may make an argument for a lower risk. And so I would just recommend getting a group together and discussing what you think these risks should be. Now, as far as a qualitative approach, I feel like that one's a little bit harder to do with your vendors because the qualitative is obviously using that monetary value and all these different scoring mechanisms. In the past, I haven't necessarily asked how many vulnerabilities they have in their environment. I typically just ask questions regarding the security controls. You absolutely can. If you can ask for the world, it's up to them to give it to you. So you can ask all day long. If they want to give it to you, they will. If they can't provide you any of those other reports that we talked about, the SOC 2, the AOC, or their other certifications, I would ask for that pen test report. I have done that in a couple cases. It just depends on how willing they are to separate with that information because obviously that's sensitive to their environment. Yes.
Out of those executive summaries that you've actually analyzed, is there anything you look for that determines whether or not you will score a vendor at a higher risk than not? What do you look for?
So in the past, what I typically do is, do you recall the question where I asked data classification? I know we moved through it really quickly. So for data classification, it's really important that's set up in your organization. The questions, you can do this in a SaaS. It's a little bit harder if you're just using the tools that I showed you. Rate the questions that are higher classification level, higher and more significant to your organization. So then you understand, okay, this is a high-risk vendor. They're going to have IPs and vulnerabilities about our network. And so then when you present that information to executives, okay, very high risk vendor, they're going to have the top data classification. They have these risks that make it even more high risk to our organization. And so those metrics can roll up to that executive staff so they have better understanding about that.
That was specifically related to the pen testing.
Oh, you mean to the pen test executive summary?
Yeah.
I haven't used that as a deliverable to give to anybody else other than validating the responses in their risk assessment.
So you use that as an indicator of whether or not it meets?
Yeah, because I don't want that to go to anybody else other than me. Like I said, that's a really sensitive report, and not everybody's going to be willing to part with it and give it to you. So one, right? Yeah, that's absolutely true. So for that one, you want to kind of gauge it. You don't want to just give it to anybody and, use it just to validate their responses. Go ahead. Yep. Well, if you're lucky enough to have a compliance department, compliance will sometimes do that for you. If they have adverse media or whatever it may be. If you're assessing a lot of vendors, let's just say 20 a week, you're not going to be able to do that. It's just going to be a huge workload unless you're able to automate pulling those resources. If you do 1 to 2 vendors a week, or maybe 1 every week, then you may be able to do that and be able to get a more accurate representation of your vendor. But I don't think you could do it if you're getting a lot of vendors, unfortunately. Any other questions? Yes. There's a couple resources that you can use. I do think that some people use SIG, but SIG is huge. And also, it's built very generically. If you have the time, you can build a questionnaire that's more applicable to your organization. I would highly recommend using the Nist Cybersecurity framework and going line by line out of those controls, because it's a lot smaller than the SIG, and you can make the questions better suited to your environment and ask them the way that you want versus using a questionnaire that you just pull down from the internet. Yes. Yeah. So that phase of the vendor life cycle, I feel like, is a black hole. Vendors will leave the organization, the contracts will be terminated, and security hardly ever finds out. To be honest with you, I have not found a way to make that effective where we're actually validating that that information has been destroyed. Like I said, it just turns into a black hole, and every company is like that. I've been at several different companies. I've been at healthcare, I've been at retail, and now I'm a consultant. And everywhere I've gone, that turns into the black hole. You can put that in your policies and your procedures, but until you get your whole organization on board with what the life cycle of a vendor should look like and what should happen at the end, the problem's still going to continue to be there. So, I would start with the effective communication. That's like my number one go-to, because the process isn't going to work unless the organization is on board and they support the process. But then taking it a step further and auditing that they're actually removing that data. Me being me, I would get on a Skype call or a video conference and have them prove to me that they removed the data. But it just depends on what the vendor's providing to you and if they can remove that data, because sometimes there are circumstances where they can't remove the data for, a certain amount of years or duration because they need to be able to audit that information. That will typically be written into the contract. Other vendors, a consultant per se, they shouldn't keep the data past then. They should remove the data when the contract is over. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I think you guys helped me extend this much longer than it had went on. I appreciate that. All right. Like I said, you can reach me on any of these if you have any other questions. I don't mind